Happy Tuesday, guys.
Hi.
Happy Tuesday. We hope your week's going well. Today we are going to be learning the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. So, of course, we're going to sing the song, Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho. Okay? And the girls know the refrain really well, so they're going to sing that with me, and I'm going to sing the verses along. All right, here we go. Are you ready? Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. You may talk about your men of Gideon, you may talk about your men of Saul, but there's none like good old Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Right up to the walls of Jericho, they marched with spear in hand. Go blow them ram horns, Joshua cried, 'cause the battle is in our hands. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Then the lamb sheep horns began to blow, and the trumpets began to sound. Joshua told the children to shout that morn, and the walls came a-tumbling down.
Joshua fought the Battle of
Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Thanks for singing.
Whoa. I want a fake seat.
Alright, so yesterday in our story, God had given his people the 10 Commandments. They were wandering through the desert, and he was keeping them safe with food and water and safety. And today we're going to learn how they are going to leave the desert and enter a special place that God promised them. So this is called the warrior leader, and it comes from the book of Joshua in the battle, the chapters 3 and 6. So if you want to read this when we're done, it's from Joshua 3 and 6. After Moses died, God gave his people a new leader. His name was Joshua, which means the Lord saves. Joshua was going to lead God's people into the special land God had promised to give them. By this time, God's people had been wandering around in that baking desert for 40 years. So you can imagine how sick they were of sand and anything yellow and tense and walking and being hot. And how happy they were to reach the edge of the desert and to see their beautiful new home right there in front of them, all cool and green and lovely. There was only one problem: Jericho. Jericho was a city, but it wasn't just any old city. It was a fortress, and it stopped anyone from getting into the land. The people looked at Jericho, at the big, giant, scary walls all around it, at the tall, towering ramparts, at the heavy iron gates bolted shut, at each other. What would they do? No one knew. But God knew. And God told Joshua what to do. But Joshua must have looked surprised, because it was a very odd battle plan indeed, as we'll soon find out. And then God made his people a promise. I will always be with you, and I will never, ever leave you. If you do what I say, your lives in the new land will be happy, and everything will go well. So Joshua gathered his army together. They had their swords and spears and shields. They were ready to fight. But the plan wasn't about fighting. It was about trusting and doing what God said. Joshua's army went marching, marching, marching around the city, day after day after day. They're too scared to fight, the people of Jericho said. But they were wrong. God's people weren't scared. They were waiting for God to tell them what to do next. On the seventh day, God told his people to march around the city not once, but 7 times. Then God told everyone to make as much noise as they could. Has anyone ever told you to make as much noise as you possibly can? Well, imagine that noise. Add 39,999 other people making that noise too, and you get the idea. Ear splitting. And as it turned out, stone splitting too, because the huge, strong walls of Jericho just crumbled to the ground as if they were made of sand. Jericho vanished in a great cloud of dust. So it was that God's people entered their new home, and they didn't have to fight to get in. They only had to walk. Joshua said, "God has brought you safely here. Now will you do what he says?" Everyone said, "We promise." "Only God can make your heart happy," Joshua said, "so don't pray to pretend gods." "No," they said, "never." I'm afraid they didn't keep their promise. They didn't do what God said, and many years later, just as God warned them, things would go badly for God's people. They would lose their home. Enemies would capture them and take them off as slaves, and God's people would scatter into many different lands. But God's plan was still working. One day, he would give his people another leader and another home. But this home, no one could ever take away from them. Ready for my questions?
Yeah.
Can you read them for us?
What battle directions did God give the Israelites? Where did God lead his people?
Go ahead. You can remember to pause this and talk about them if you want before we go through the answers. Number 1, what battle directions did God give the Israelites? Well, it kind of probably seemed a little weird because they weren't actually supposed to fight. They were supposed to march around the city. Just march, 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 march. And then on the 7th day, they were supposed to march even more. They were supposed to march 7 times. And then at the end of that 7th time, what did they have to do?
Shout!
They had to shout and blow the ram's horns as loud as they could, and the walls of Jericho fell down. Now, that's not from what they did. The noise must have been loud, but God was with them, and God was making these things happen. And then number 2, where did God lead his people? Well, this was called the Promised Land, or Canaan, and Jericho was the first thing that they had to conquer to get inside. And so God led his people out of Egypt, out of slavery, and then through the desert and into the Promised Land. So God had promised to give them this place, and he kept his promise. This was their new home. This week we are doing some God, I'm sorry prayers. Remember that every time we come to God and tell him that we are sorry for sins that we commit, he always promises that he will forgive us. Those sins are wiped away, and all because of what Jesus has done for us. So today we say another God, I'm sorry prayer. Dear God, we're sorry for the times when we might have felt silly or embarrassed following your directions. Help us remember that following you shows you love, and it is always what is best for our lives. Amen.
Amen.